Buying an existing business always looks like a great shortcut and opportunity to acquire either an L1, E2, or possibly EB1C. But the reality is a lot more complicated and nuanced. In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into what's entailed in acquiring a business, and is it always an easier and better option to acquire an existing business for one of these visa options? Welcome back, everybody. My name is Charles Raether, and for nearly 20 years, I've been assisting people such as yourselves in acquiring temporary or permanent residency or even citizenship here in the US. And since we focus a lot of our work on working with entrepreneurs and investors and business people, today we wanted to talk about a very common scenario of acquiring an existing business in the US for either a non-immigrant visa such as an L1 or an E2, or possibly for a green card option such as an EB1C. And obviously you can see a lot of the advantages that exist when acquiring an existing business. You don't have to start from scratch. There's an existing client base. You've got personnel already assembled and trained and everything. And even in certain cases, such as the L1, if you file for the L1 using an existing business, you get the visa or the approval, at least from USCIS, for 3 years right away, as opposed to 1 year if you're working with a newly formed company. So on its face, there are definitely advantages of working with an existing business. However, there are more nuances to this that you should take into account prior to pulling the trigger and going forward with acquiring an existing business. First of all, in addition to those advantages I just mentioned about having an existing client base, staff in place, reputation, goodwill, stuff like that, there's also the flip side of potential liabilities, right? So if you're acquiring an ongoing operation, there could be unknown tax liabilities, commercial obligations, unpaid debts, even potential lawsuits from disgruntled employees or even clients in the past. So that's why due diligence is extremely important when considering acquiring an existing business. Now, there's the two ways are you could have a share purchase or an asset purchase. Now, from a purely legal point of view, an asset purchase is always better. Why? Because you're just purchasing the assets of the company. You're not buying the legal entity. You're not buying the shares of the legal entity. You're just saying, I'm buying this equipment from you. I'm taking over this lease. I'm buying these customer lists, buying maybe some know-how, intellectual property, stuff like that. So you're kind of picking and choosing and only acquiring particular assets. You're not buying the company. So in that case, you're protected very well. I mean, I can't say always, but extremely well protected from any potential lawsuits against the company itself or the previous owners. So again, like if you had a disgruntled employee, you had some tax obligations that the prior owner had, unpaid taxes, federal taxes, state taxes, you're not taking on any obligations for those when you're just acquiring the assets. But if you're acquiring the business itself, you're buying the shares of the company, then in that case, you step into the shoes of the previous owners and you take on all of the liabilities that they did, unless you clearly carve them out in the sale purchase agreement. So you could say, any tax obligations that come up over the next year or the next 5 years that are related to operations before the acquisition, those are the obligations of the seller. But again, here too, even if the seller gives you a commitment to cover those obligations, there's a risk. What happens, if that seller, dies or goes bankrupt, or they just refuse to honor their obligations? And there are various legal mechanisms that we can put into an agreement to raise the likelihood that they would cover those obligations. It could be something as basic as creating, a contingency fund that the seller of the business has to keep a certain amount of money in an escrow account to cover any future liabilities. Usually they're not too eager to do something like that, but there are various structures we can set up to try to protect you when you're acquiring the business. But again, this is something you have to work through very carefully, not only with an immigration lawyer, but also a corporate attorney prior to acquiring the company. There are also issues related to acquiring a company that you should keep in mind. For example, most relatively small companies. So again, we're not talking about Fortune 500 companies that will continue operating even after the CEO dies. And if it's a smaller company, it's the success of the business is probably very closely linked to personalities. First and foremost, the personality of the owner. So you need to keep in mind, once you take over that business, are the clients going to just leave because they had such a close relationship with the previous owners? Or are the employees going to be happy with the new owners, or are they going to follow the old owners as well? So you need to keep in mind the profitability of the company going forward after the change of ownership, and how much the business is really linked and tied to the current owners. And that's something that you're going to have to assess yourselves. That's not really a legal question, but you also need to assess it from the perspective of acquiring and keeping the visa. So let's say, for example, and this gets back to also part of the due diligence. Let's say, you want to acquire a business. They're telling you the company's generating, 100,000 net, earnings every year. But once you take over the business, well, maybe those numbers were inflated. Maybe some of those claimed earnings all of a sudden disappeared because a lot of the clients decided to go elsewhere once the company was sold. And then you might be in a pickle of having to get a renewal for your visa and your income is insufficient, especially in the case of an E2. That's probably the case where they're most likely to look at your income. And if all of a sudden the earnings of the company plummet, that could create problems when you go to renew your visa. That issue is maybe less common, like say in an EB1 scenario, because from the time you acquire the business until you file, it's usually a pretty short period of time. So you're probably protected from any large fluctuations of earnings and stuff like that. And so, if there's a problem of earnings going down because of the old owners leaving, it's generally not something that comes up as often in an EB1C scenario, although it's still something you need to keep. In addition, you need to keep in mind that you'll have to continue to oversee and supervise and manage the development of the business. Now, if it's an existing business and it's got a team in place already, theoretically, that role and obligation on you will be much less. And you hopefully, as long as nobody leaves the company, you'll be able to continue to manage the business successfully, even in a passive role. But again, you need to assess the capabilities of the team that you're hiring and assess how much your involvement and day-to-day involvement in the operations of the business will be required, or can you take a step back and take on more of a passive leadership role? Now, people might ask us, well, what's the best, if I were looking at acquiring an existing business, what would be the best type of business to acquire from an immigration perspective? And unfortunately, there's no one answer, magic silver bullet that applies to everybody. I would say in general, one of the most successful structures are ones where, first of all, they're not overly dependent on the personality of the owner, right? So if the seller turns over the business to you and he leaves or she leaves, is the business going to fall apart? You really don't want a business that's really linked directly to the person who's owning the business. Other considerations, I would say, kind of construction, manufacturing, those kind of businesses, they tend to be more stable, less tied to personalities, and they then tend to be more appealing to the immigration service. Because if you've got manufacturing or construction involved, you've got various functions in the business, right? You've got, maybe a production department, and you've got a sales, and maybe shipping and logistics and marketing. And so immigration likes to see a diversity of functions and obligations and different types of specialists and managers, a manager of maybe finance and marketing and stuff like that. So when you have that diversity of operations and management and functions, that always makes for a stronger case as well. In conclusion, what I would say is the most important issue to keep in mind when acquiring an existing business is the due diligence, whether it's legal due diligence, tax due diligence, and everything. Because even if you are able to acquire the business, those mistakes or problems that come up later will not only threaten your financial stake and financial investment, but also your immigration status. And so that's a double whammy that you really would like to avoid. Therefore, I would say it's critical to get your immigration attorney involved before you sign the LOI, much more before the closing on the business, to make sure all the I's are dotted and that the business is in compliance with the immigration requirements, both now and for the foreseeable future, to avoid any possible problems as you move forward on your journey in transitioning to the U.S. If you have any questions about this or other aspects related to business and investment immigration to the U.S., please feel free to reach out to us. We have nearly 20 years of experience, and I'm sure our team can provide very helpful guidance and develop a strategy for you and your family.